Hello, everyone. This is the first video in for the second week of course. Thomas Aquinas on law. So, a couple of things I think are really important in this reading to sort of get you started. First of all, we're dealing with a 13th century Christian Catholic theologian. The world that Thomas Aquinas lived in, the high point of the Middle Ages, maybe in Europe, it was an age of faith, and there were no really serious thinkers who weren't also religious thinkers, you might say. Everything was informed by a religious point of view, and that is certainly the point of view that Thomas has. And so you could call that view theological in the sense that it's always informed by an understanding of the basics of religion, especially, of course, the Christian religion. So clearly, any ethics, any theory of morality that Thomas has will be very closely bound up with that theological or God-centered view. A couple of things I think right away in this reading that we want to focus on, definitely get straight. And the first is his very notion of what law is. Law. The first thing he says is law is a rule and measure of actions. That is, if we think about morality as an attempt to answer certain basic questions about what we should do, what is right, what is wrong. This notion of having a rule or measure, a criterion, a standard by which to judge actions is at the very center of it. And for him, it's law. Law is that which is a rule and measure of our actions, that it tells us what to do, what not to do, and gives us a basis for judging whether what we do or other people do is right or wrong. Law is a rule and measure of actions. So the question, of course, is what is law and where does it come from? What law? Law is a rule and measure of actions through which one is induced to act or restrained from acting. And as law tells you to do something or tells you not to do something. Lex, which is the Latin term, this is written in Latin. Lex, law, is derived from legare, the Latin verb legare, to bind, because it binds one to act. That's, I think, the most important thing to keep in mind, this notion of law as something which binds us. And it opens up a lot of questions, because that notion of being bound, of something binding you, is really the question of obligation, the question of duty. Somebody may tell you to do something, you may tell yourself to do something, but most of the time it's merely a suggestion. Why don't you do this or that? It's a much different thing to say you have an obligation to do this or that. You have a duty to do this or that. And that's really what he's interested in. Is there some source of authority that can bind us to act, that can oblige us, that can impose duties upon us? That's the real question when it comes to law. For Thomas, only the law can do that. I mean, a human being can tell you to do something. They may even tell you have to do something, but it's not an obligation unless we refer to something that has a higher authority than simply a human authority, right? There are plenty of people in this world who think that they are that higher authority, and they're all wrong. The only real authority over a person has to come from something bigger, something more important than another person. So we can say we're, kind of looking for that source of authority that can really bind us, that can induce us to act or restrain us from to act in that sense of morally oblige us to do or to not do something. And that is law. But then the question is, what is law? What are we talking about? And this is perhaps the most famous and important thing in the whole of Thomas Aquinas's moral philosophy, and that is these three levels of law. Know them well: eternal law, natural law, and human law. Eternal law, natural law, and human law. Thomas Aquinas thinks that law can be understood to exist on three different levels, and the most profound and deepest and foundational is eternal law, which is essentially the law of God. It's the dictate of the supreme being for how the universe should be, including us and how we should act. Natural law is our partial grasp of eternal law. Remember, God in the Judeo-Christian tradition, really the Christian tradition, the Christian theological tradition, is thought of as an infinite being, a perfect being who cannot be known in this life, at least, in any kind of full sense. So the eternal law, which is the mind of God or dictate of God or providence, we human beings are finite and limited and imperfect, fallible in a way that God isn't. So our grasp of the eternal law is also going to be fallible and partial. But that partial grasp of God's law is what natural law is. Finally, the last level, which is, see what you can see this, eternal law is the absolute foundation. Natural law is built upon that. And then human law is built at the top on the basis of natural law. You can see how these different levels fit together. Human law is just the laws that we make, that human beings make. It's what they say is right or wrong. It's what they say is good or bad to do in a community. It's the laws they make, the actual positive laws that are made in a community about what is not to be done. Those are examples of human law. But very crucially, human law is only valid if it's an accurate reflection of natural law, because natural law is the built upon eternal law. You can see that. So human law is whatever we say goes, but it doesn't really have any authority unless it is based on natural law. That's why, a human being telling you what to do, it's a joke unless they, in some way or another, are simply passing on what the natural law says you should do. Right? They're just standing in for it, interpreting it, maybe serving as the medium of it. So we need to look back at these three levels. But the first thing to note is that there are these three levels and the way that they fit together. Again, eternal law, he says a law is nothing more than a dictate of the practical reason emanating from a ruler who governs some perfect community. Assuming that the world, everything, is ruled by divine providence, it is clear that the whole community of the universe is governed by divine reason, the mind of God. God is the ruler of the entire world, meaning the everything, the universe. And his, what do they call it? His dictates are, they determine what is and what should be. Now, he then describes natural law. And natural law is not the law of nature in the sense of the law of the jungle, or no, quite the contrary. Natural law is the law that exists naturally in us, in our reason, in our thinking capacity, our intellectual capacity. It's natural in the sense that we find it there. We don't have to be told it. We don't have to be taught it. We can discover it in ourselves. And what does that mean? Well, it means the basic principles of morality, the basic principles of what's good, what's bad, what's decent, what's indecent, of justice, mercy, um, fairness, proportionality. All these things exist in terms of general principles within us. And they are meant to be, as he says, it is our partial participation in the eternal law. Right. So he says at the end of this on natural law, thus it is clear that natural law is nothing other than the rational creature's participation in the eternal law. And again, that participation is partial, but the idea is that we know the basic principles of morality because we can see them, and that what we see is a partial glimpse of God's eternal law. And then human law is an attempt to put the general principles, again, these are general principles of natural law, into effect in particular situation, in particular determinations, as he says. So this is where things get tricky, because we may say that it is wrong to kill. That killing is wrong. Thou shalt not kill, whatever. I mean, the natural law would say we have a general principle that tells us that killing is bad and we shouldn't do it. But then there are exceptions: self-defense, killing in war, perhaps the death penalty, and then we have to figure out how to determine what the exceptions are. And so, generally, the problem is how do we interpret and apply the general principles of natural law into particular situations, and that calls for judgment, of course, and that's where things get arguable.